second installment of Midrash 2.0, and we are currently doing Parasha Vayigash, and we need to ask the question, what is the significance of Jacob going down to Jacob going down to Egypt versus Israel going down to Egypt? That and more as we continue this Midrash and we get ourselves prepared for the big climactic Rabbi's nugget at the end of the day. So we are building, and as we go, we are basically answering questions on the Midrash channel on Slack, which is our congregation's communications hub. Next question.
So question number 5, why did Joseph tell them not to quarrel?
Yes, why did Joseph tell them not to quarrel? It's an interesting thing. There are a number of things in this Midrash, in this Parasha Vayigash that are so significant that they, if neglected, could alter your doctrine. And then there are these little subtle nuances where Torah has inserted something that just seems a little bit out of place of everything else. And so let me read the verse to you. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And let me go ahead and set this up real quick because I left it on the Hebrew here, and we'll go ahead and jump back over to the New Living Translation just for the sake of these verses. And that is in what verse?
It's chapter 45, verse 24.
24. Okay. So let's see, let me share my screen here. So in chapter 45, verse 24, it says, so Joseph sent his brothers off, and as they left, he called after them, don't quarrel about all this along the way. Okay. And so I asked the question in the Midrash questions. I asked, why did Joseph tell them not to quarrel? So first of all, what I would like to do is give an opportunity for people to give their opinion and unmute and say what they think is the reason why Joseph told them not to quarrel.
Well, I think first off, it wasn't but just a few chapters ago that we were still looking at Judah and Reuben vying for, and was it Reuben? I might be mistaken. It was Reuben vying for this what seems to be the position of firstborn.
Okay.
And they just found out that their brother was alive, and that he was this difficult man that they had to deal with in Egypt, that wasn't going to see them again for food unless they brought his other brother Benjamin, and the one that threw them in jail and called them spies. I think that they use the word difficult man when they're talking to their father. It's something like that, you know. Um, but they just found out that this difficult man is their brother. And when he reveals himself, they're dismayed. They don't know how to process the information. It wasn't even registering in the banks that could be a possibility.
Right. And the Hebrew word there, the concept is effort without production.
Right. Yeah. Utterly stunned.
Yeah.
Like jaw drop. You know, we would have used those words nowadays. So, and now they're heading back to their father with this information. And the thoughts that must be rushing through their mind, I can only imagine, you know, things like, oh crap. Right? Like, how did we get here? You know, how are we going to tell our father this information without him having a heart attack on the spot? And of course, I'm using today's terminology, but all those types of things. And then, you know, we still have the position of firstborn still available. So there might be some tit for tat type of things going through their mind. There might be the, you know, whose fault was this to begin with, because blame's going to get thrown down somewhere. That's what I think is probably going through their heads, and that and a lot more. But I could, if I put myself in their position, I could see that.
That was one of the big things that I kept coming back to was, how are they going to explain the lie that they've lived all these years to their father?
Mm-hmm.
And they've got to come to the truth of the matter, because it's the lie is going to get exposed and the truth is going to come out, because Pops is going to be saying, hey, what happened? And he's going to be telling his story. And that's going to change some things. And then getting back to the birthright question, I don't understand why there's such a juggling of it. Okay, I can understand if something happens to the firstborn, wouldn't the next, I mean, in my mind, logically, wouldn't the next one move up? Or was it back then based upon who had the leadership or the gumption to elevate themselves to that position? Or was it about that at all?
Honey, you would know better than I.
Okay. Those are all really logical, right? There's definitely a psychological element to, you staged a murder and now here's the body. And they're alive, right? That there's a given there. But I want to propose to you that is actually, and I'm not trying to insult you guys, but that's Christianese.
Mm.
That is the hogwash that we've been fed about a fearful human falling into the hands of a wrathful God. When truth be told is that that's not what's actually being communicated in the Hebrew. Let me show you. And those are all good sentiments. I mean, I want you to understand, I'm not saying that kind of stuff didn't enter their minds, right? That they didn't go, oh, shoot, you know, or that they were like gonna try to fight about who should be, you know, his right hand man or something like that, because the disciples did that stuff, right? But there's something deep here. What I want to show you is these Psalms. Okay. So Psalm 4:4, and this is in the NLT, the New Living Translation. Don't sin by letting anger control you. Think about it overnight and remain silent. Psalm 18:7. The earth quaked and trembled. The foundations of the mountains shook. They quaked because of his anger. Psalm 77:16. When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. Your thunder roared from the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Psalm 77:18. Psalm 99:1. Yahweh is king. Let the nations tremble. He sits on his throne between the cherubim. Let the whole earth quake. So let's talk about this for a minute. Before I show you this, what I really want you, the concept that I really want you to get here is that this has nothing to do with quarreling. What this has to do with is the flowing of anxious energies as the result of a realization of the terror you just encountered. Okay? And the concept of Yahweh being wrathful is very misunderstood in the sense that there's a lack of Hebrew knowledge behind the concept of wrath. And what I mean by that is the word wrath itself basically means nostrils, and it's the flaring of the nostrils. But there's something very important about that, and that is that the concept is based upon another Hebrew idiom called long in the nose. Anywhere where you see the words long suffering, what it really says is that God is long in the nose. And the premise behind it is that there would be a flaring of the nostrils that basically indicates tolerance. In other words, all the places where you see the word wrath translated in English literally means I'm going to put up with it. I'm going to tolerate it. I'm going to go ahead and accept that you are weaker, not as intelligent, and not as powerful. And I'm going to accept that because I created you. You need to remember, and this is important, the Torah at large, and I mean that as a person and as a written document and as a spirit that dwells within us, is actually going to communicate two things throughout its thematic connections, all the way through the Tanakh, all the way into the latter writings, the narratives of Yeshua, the epistles of Paul. We will find two themes: father and husband. Those are anthropomorphic relations. What I mean by that, we as humans have frames of reference by which we operate that where we cannot relate to God at all. Now, where this becomes important is in the concept that anthropomorphic references to God do not actually exist. God is an energy. Get over it. There's no hands, no feet, no eyes, no ears, no wrath, no love, none of those things. There is just a constant state of benevolence. And there is a constant state of giving. It would be like somebody who went and they went and found one of those angel tree tickets and they bought it. And on it, it said that the kid wanted a dolly, right? It would be like that person giving a dolly to the kid once a day for the rest of their lives. The principle is that it's an intensifying benevolence of gifts. God does not have emotional deficits like us. He doesn't get angry. There's no such thing as anger. But what we need is a frame of reference that we can relate to. And so what would be defined by most people, including JPS Tanakh, as the word wrath is actually the tolerance of God, the nose of God. And we've inappropriately translated that as wrath. But the nose of God has to do with the idea of flaring and not reacting. And that sentiment is present throughout. So what's Joseph telling them here? Don't tremble. Don't be absolutely terrified because of what has just happened. But I'm going to kind of tell you that what he says here has nothing to do with this story. Let me share with you why I think that. Why what Joseph says here could potentially be advice for the rest of the generations of Israel. So Joseph, let me see. Let me go back to let's go back to Genesis here real quick. Okay. So first of all, this is what you need to see. We've already studied this. This is Vayishalach. Vayishalach. And what was the deep midrashic discussion that we had? What was the rabbi's nugget of that whole entire Torah portion? That Vayishalach was actually a releasing of debt. So the first thing it says is, and when he forgave them, his brothers, and they walked, not departed, and they walked, he said to them, do not tremble in the path. I want you to think about what you just saw. You see, Christianity would present this, that they, even if they looked in the Strongs and saw that trembling, or looked in the Strongs and saw the other places where that verse is used, or where that word in the Hebrew is used, there is a misunderstanding because of the assumption of wrath. And that is not a Hebrew lifestyle. And you need to remember the Hebrew lifestyle was developed by Abraham through his experience with Yahweh. He learned from his God how to do this religion. He learned from his God how to create a lifestyle within a dominant culture that was very different. He learned how to do this within the context of his mystical understanding that added Yahweh to the equation. He was already a magician. He was already a chasdim, studying under Nimrod of all people, right? Because his father was in Nimrod's court. So now we see this is Joseph's words of forgiveness. And Torah calls it out. It's inserted. If you look at the verse before, it says in verse 23, he also sent his father 10 male donkeys loaded with the finest products of Egypt and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other supplies he would need on his journey. And then look at verse 25, and they left Egypt and returned to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. You could take 24 out and the narrative would not skip a beat. The narrative skips a beat because of this verse 24. So that's why I asked the question, what is the significance? Right? Why did he say don't quarrel? Any thoughts on that before we move on? Paula K had mentioned during lunch that this entire parasha is about forgiveness. Yes, I agree, but not Christian forgiveness, because there's two elements to Christian forgiveness that are very dangerous. Christian forgiveness is contingent upon the doctrine of hell and original sin. You see, when it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and restore us from all unrighteousness, the Catholic Church told the peasantry, told the constituency, not the leadership, that they needed to have absolution from hell, that they needed to be delivered from the wrath of God. Where did they get this concept? Tertullian, Marcion, Origen, and worst of all, Ignatius. Now, what's imperative here is that these doctrines are argued by who the church calls heretics. Now, granted, there was legitimate heresy, like Marcion saying there's two different gods, an Old Testament wrathful God, which Augustine loved that doctrine and decided that all humans were evil. Where did he get that from? Well, he got it from a number of different sources. But I can tell you that Voltaire seems to parrot that nonsense, that humans are inherently evil, not inherently good. But truth be told, it's the minority of people. It's not the majority of humans that actually demonstrate a streak of built-in natured evil. If it was the case that we are dealing with evil people trying to be good, somewhere in there we have to accept that evil people trying to be good indicates that they can't be good. Oh, that's Calvinism all day. Total depravity, right? We can't be good. But what would we have? We would have a population of mental health facilities and prison facilities outdoing the population who's actually trying to do good. So I propose that even anthropology and psychology indicate that we are actually good people who make mistakes. Christianese dictates that Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers is because of what they deserved in the wrath. But truth be told, is Joseph just wanted them to have shalom, because he had, as a master Kabbalist, He had determined the truth behind the bigger picture. And I say as a master Kabbalist because he had learned how to what? He had learned how to connect with the divine. And he had learned how to do that in a state of contraction. And I will propose to you that when I say that, I'm not trying to say that people who are successful in their spiritual journey with God have to be Kabbalists. No, but what I'm saying is there's an understanding that the mysticism that Joseph practiced played a role here. And in the power behind releasing the debt, selling the debt to somebody else to collect, there is a focus and a concept of allowing space for that person to change. And that's exactly what Joseph has done here. He interrupted Torah. Torah's running along with its narrative. And all of a sudden, Joseph's like, nope, we're inserting that. Now, we know it was not written for Joseph. Joseph was living his life. But he creates an anomaly in the very voice of God. In a context of a God who, according to humanity at large, is some jerk who can't handle a few mistakes from his ant pile. Not okay. So, yes, this verse is very significant. In fact, this verse is actually a taste of next week's parasha, which is, I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to say, be here next week. But what's imperative is to understand that when Torah calls something out, when Torah interrupts the narrative, pay attention, because it probably has something to do with the kingdom of heaven, has to do with your Messiah, has to do with your future. It says, Vayishalach, when he sent them away. What is that sending away? Forgiving. When he sent them away, when he sent them away, when he released them from the debt, he tells them, don't tremble. Don't tremble in your path. What's he saying there? Walk in your full potential. Do not allow your guilt to limit your beliefs about who you are. You are the bride of the Creator and need to accept that privilege without merit. Do not look at what you've done. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. He goes on later on to say to them, don't, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Don't let it bother you, right? Okay. So, next question. Actually, let's take a minute, see if anybody wants to comment.
Okay.
Anybody want to comment on what I just said? Do you understand the difference between Christian forgiveness and Hebrew forgiveness? Christian forgiveness is I like how who was it that said that? I think it was Rabbi Messer said it is not asbestos underwear. Forgiveness is not an avoidance of hell. That's not why God forgives people. God forgives people to give them space to change. God forgives people to give them a vessel to fill. In fact, forgiveness at large is a vessel, but that's getting too deep into that discussion. So what is the next question?
And forgiveness also requires action.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know,
it's verbal
not
language.
It's not just, oh, I forgive you and everything's wiped away and we forget about everything. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is when there is actual action and change. And that's what his brother, that's what he was, in my opinion, that's what he was doing with his brother. He was testing his brothers to see if they had changed.
Mm-hmm.
And when he saw that they had changed, he was able to completely forgive them. They had earned that forgiveness. But what people also need to remember is just because you forgive somebody and they show you they're changing doesn't mean they always get access back to where they were.
Yeah, because truth be told is, number one, hindsight's 2020, but they never do forgive themselves.
Yes.
Because they try to manipulate later on. But then a furthermore thing that I would like to show you is this in verse 23, I believe it is. Yeah, in verse 23. So when we talk about Vaishalak being forgiveness, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Because if you're reading in the Hebrew, this is going to be kind of a no-brainer, but you don't see this in the English. So when we talk about forgiveness, we talk about shalach being about forgiveness, or a shlicha being about the sending away with a blessing, right? The concept is you can't send somebody away without blessing them first. That's a Hebrew rule. If they leave your presence, you send them away in shalom. Okay? So the concept here is that this word shalach means to send away, right? And if you think about it, it's interesting because here we have a cognate. What do I mean by that? The Hebrew word to walk is the word lach. In this case, lach is spelled with a chet instead of a chet. Instead of a kaf, right? And truth be told is that the root word is shal, which means to ask, right? But we're not going to mess with that. What we're going to say is that the permutation of a parent root here could be that this is the sheen of pressure, pressing against what? The walk, or pressing them to walk, pressuring them to walk. Let's talk about halakha real quick. Halakha is the proper practice of religion. Okay? That's the definition in rabbinical circles. The proper practice of religion. And every synagogue, because every rabbi has his own opinion, including me, has what? Their own halakha, their own interpretation on how they're going to walk things out. In one of the books that I read, which was like the joys and vicissitudes of being a rabbi, one of the things that it said in there was that he had a Kohen who wore mismatched socks. Now, if you know anything about the Kohens, you'll know that they are descendants of the priesthood, and they're the only ones that are allowed to take the scroll out of the ark, lay it on the bina, roll it out, and roll it to the right spot, right? So they're the ones who, during Havdalah, which is the end of Shabbat, go and get the scroll out of the ark, roll it to the next parasha, put it back in the ark so that it is ready for the next synagogue Shabbat service. They're also usually the only ones who have the care and the responsibility of the shofar, and they're also the only ones that handle the responsibility of the eternal light, and they're also the only ones who handle the responsibility of the cantering. However, some synagogues don't necessarily practice that. Here's my point. He had a Kohen who would get the scroll out of the ark, take it to the bina. Guess what? When they do that, they remove their shoes. And so here's this dude going and getting the scroll out of the ark and putting it on the bina. And the bima is sitting up on a stage, and so everybody can see his different colored socks. Well, they went to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, this is an uproar. We can't have this. He has to wear matched socks. And so the synagogue eventually came up with a halakha that you have to wear matched socks if you're a Kohen. That's an example of halakha within a synagogue. Not every synagogue is going to have, there's going to be Kohens with mismatched socks, but at this synagogue, that ain't happening anymore because of the uproar, right? Okay. So you could see how halakha is imperative to the concept of walking out Torah correctly. That's what rabbis teach halakha is. And we see Noah walking with God, Enoch walking with God, everybody walking with God. And so now we understand that that's practicing with God, which means what? Operating within your power, your authority, and within the connection or the connectivity of the corporate collective consciousness. In other words, being in fellowship spiritually and having dominion and having power that you don't understand, power that is a very, very lost concept to Christianity. Power that to this day we are still learning about. Okay. So what is Shalach? I'm going to send you away in your authority, your power, and a connection to the corporate collective consciousness, which means I don't want you excluded from the deep spiritual connection that people have. I don't want you to not have your power. I don't want you to not have your authority. That's shlichah. And that's why we know that a rabbi gets a shliach when he is sent out to a synagogue. He gets a paper that sends him from yeshiva, where he has graduated, to the synagogue where he will operate. Meaning he is sent away with a blessing. In Hebrew thought, you send no one away without a blessing. If you part company, you desire them to have all of those things: the authority, power, and a connection to the corporate collective consciousness. And consequently, that in and of itself is a depth of forgiveness that Christianity never even happens upon. In fact, most Christians teach that forgiveness is just giving a person permission to have done what they've done, and you still will continue in your life. And I will propose to you that when we factor in theological forgiveness, the study of forgiveness, we are seriously in error compared to the Hebrew understanding of forgiveness, because we're operating from a context that true forgiveness is asbestos underwear, that you can ride out the wrath of God like a wrath surfboard. Okay, so in principle, we see here something happening with Joseph and his father. He sends to his father, and this is important. He sends to his father what? Donkeys, right? And he sends to his father female donkeys, right? So we do have a concept of this sending, as it were. But make no mistake, the two verses are connected by the word shalach. In the deep mystical process of giving space, creating a vessel that would offer blessing, offer authority, power, and a connection to the corporate collective consciousness, is for his father as well. And one of the more important truths concerning that is actually the fact that the last time that he saw his father was putting him in a position that compromised his very freedom. So even within this very concept of sending these donkeys to his father is a concept of Hebrew forgiveness, giving space to healing. Okay. So I know we went a little bit over with that, and I know that we're probably to a point where we need to take a quick break. We'll go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so we are back, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump into this next thing that I want to show you. I'm not gonna ask the question. I'm just going to show you this because we definitely want to cover this, but I don't want to miss out on some of the other little special things. And of course, Rabbi's Nuggets coming, and you guys know that that's going to be awesome. Okay, so here we go. So this is chapter 46. Okay, now this is what I want you to pay attention to. So Jacob set out for Egypt with all his possessions, and when he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. During the night, God spoke to him in a vision Yaakov, Yaakov, he called. Here I am, Jacob replied. I am God, the God of your father. The voice said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make your family a great nation. I will go with you down to Egypt, and I will bring you back again. You will die in Egypt, but Joseph will be with you to close your eyes. So Jacob left Beersheba, and his sons took him to Egypt. They carried him and their little ones and their wives in the wagons Pharaoh had provided for them. They also took all their livestock, all of their personal belongings they had acquired in the land of Canaan. So Jacob and his entire family went to Egypt. Sons and grandsons, daughters and granddaughters, all his descendants. Okay. So something interesting has happened here. And if you're not careful, you will miss it. Okay. So let's first go to a different version and see what it actually says. Notice in the NLT, it says Jacob journeyed. But in the Hebrew, it actually says Israel, and all that he hath, and cometh to Beersheba and sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Now, before we get too caught up here, there's a number of things that I want to get into here. But the first and foremost, most important one is Jacob does not go directly to Egypt. He stops in Beersheba, which is what? The well of the oath, right? Where his father Isaac affirmed the covenant that he made with the Philistines, right? Now, it is important that we understand some very important, okay, that was kind of a redundancy. It is imperative that we understand some very key things. This concept of sacrifices. We need to stop. We need to recalibrate our brains, because what do we pretend like we see? Because we actually don't see it, but we pretend to see it because we've been programmed. We see a ram on an altar on fire being completely burned and offered to God, don't we? We see it in The Chosen. We see it in the, do we see it in The Chosen? Yeah, we see it in The Chosen, I think, where they just throw the lamb into the altar. Is that just the house of David? Maybe it's House of David. But either way, point being is there are rules concerning what actually gets put into the altar. What cuts are kept out and why. So whenever we see the word sacrifice, I want you to fix your brain. And the fixing that needs to occur is it is not a sacrifice. There is no loss. And there is definitely no concept of the shedding of blood being the imperative. And there's no concept of the destruction through fire of an entire animal. Let me tell you what's present. A covenant meal between a man and his creator. Jacob has a barbecue before he goes to Egypt. What? To enter into table fellowship. Why? Because when Joseph was torn, Jacob abandoned his covenant. Remember, I said that when he's Israel, he's operating in the covenant, and when he's Jacob, he is not. When he's Israel, he is operating within the promises, believing the promises, believing God. So who journeyed to Mitzrayim? Not Jacob. Israel. But before he goes, he stops and reconnects with God. He stops and has table fellowship with his father. Okay? Now we're going to get deeper into this. But the concept, and this is important, is that Jacob is not who stops in Beersheba. Israel does. And that means that he wants to return to covenant. Okay? Now, you could argue with me. You could probably go back and find instances where Jacob is part of the covenant process. But I want you to think more along the lines that when a name change occurs, a lifestyle change occurs, an enabling occurs, and a relocation occurs. And I'm going to propose to you that this is why Torah calls this out. Here's another anomaly, an interruption in the narrative. What's he doing in Beersheba? He's supposed to be going to Egypt. Furthermore, it says Israel journeyed, but then it says that they carried Jacob down to Egypt. If you're not careful, you will not catch this. You will not see the power of this anomaly. What's another anomaly? Israel leaves the land of Canaan with what? All of his covenant proof. Something Pharaoh told him to abandon. Abandon your covenant proof, because you'll have everything you want down here. Jacob takes all that he had received, right?
So explain why Israel has a vision and God calls him Jacob twice.
Do me a favor, read question 7.
Question 7. Why did Elohim call Israel Jacob?
Okay.
I didn't read it ahead of time.
We can segue into that, but I want to call out the fact that Israel journeyed to Beersheba. Okay? Israel journeyed to Beersheba. However, even though Israel journeyed to Beersheba, his sons are the ones who bear Israel away, Jacob, their father. Now, work with me on this, because this is going to get deep and a little bit hard to understand. Okay. So number one, what we need to understand is that Israel stops at Beersheba, and Israel does the table fellowship. If you want to understand this in its entirety, go watch the video in this playlist called How to Satiate a God, and you will understand 100% how off the wall it is to believe that bloodshed is the imperative in the sacrificing of an animal. And furthermore, how off the wall it is to believe that you have to hurt an animal for your sake. Okay? That sickness that is present in Christianity about a substitutionary sacrifice, and the inappropriate application of soteriology in the theological schools, that bloodshed is imperative, violates the very Noahic covenant that mankind was given and promised to continue to receive a benefit from through the rainbow. Again, that video is called How to Satiate a God. And I can tell you, once you understand that concept, you will never be the same again. You will sit in your pew on Sunday morning and your pastor will say something, you say, that's not true. Don't do it. Don't stand up and do that. I can speak from experience. It doesn't work out well. Okay. So the premise is that basically what we have here is now Israel does this table fellowship with God, which means that he was out of covenant somehow. And you could go back and study what that is. But also, here's the other part of it. Israel has the vision in the night, and what's happening? God calls to Jacob. Jacob. He says it twice. And of course, Jacob responds, here I am. Why did he do that? Why did Jacob accept the name Jacob? Why didn't Israel say, wait a minute, I'm Jacob? Go ahead, say it.
Because he was operating in his fear.
He was operating in his fear. He was out of covenant in his mind. And he says, I am the God of your father. Why does Yahweh have to tell Yaakov or Israel, whoever he is at that moment, I'm the God of your father? Why? Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. He has this vision of these angels going up and down this ladder, right? Wakes up and says, this is no other than the place of God. And if you will be with me and I will have food and I will be safe and I get to return to my father's house, that I will give you a tithe and I will make this place a house of worship. And the rabbis teach that was Moriah where he was sleeping. That's where the kotel is. The Wailing Wall. In fact, some rabbis who were bold enough, like myself, say that Jacob was sleeping on the rock that the dome is over, where Muhammad supposedly received his revelation about the Quran, which could have happened. But I can tell you, however it works out, he says, I'll make you a temple and I will give you a tithe. Oh, if we could wake up and realize that Jacob's the only one who agreed with Yahweh about the covenant and initiates the covenant, right? Oh, but it gets worse, doesn't it? Now, all of a sudden, God has to reintroduce himself. I'm the God of your father. Well, what other God was operating in Jacob's life then? That there has to be an introduction. I am the God of your father, right? Then what does he say? Do not be afraid. Now we get the gist of it. He was operating within his fear. Therefore, Yahweh had to call him Jacob, which should tell you something very, very important. Yahweh is going to meet you exactly where you're at. The universe is going to meet you exactly where you're at. Your abundance is going to meet you exactly where you're at. Your power is going to meet you exactly where you're at. Now, we see something happen. Let me show you, just so you can see it with your eyes, because I think seeing with the eyes, seeing this with the eyes, changes. Young's literal translation of the Bible is the only one that I use to really nail down what the Hebrew probably says in the English. Who traveled to Beersheba? Israel. Who leaves Beersheba? Verse 5. And Jacob rises from Beersheba. And his sons, the sons of Israel, oh, that's going to be important. Sons of Israel bear Jacob, their father. So Jacob doesn't even go down into Egypt. His sons bring him down into Egypt. Sons of whom?
Israel.
Meaning what?
But Jacob eventually walks in his identity.
Actually, that his sons were operating covenant and their father was not. Let that sink in for a minute. Think about that for a minute. Israel goes to Beersheba. Why? Because he wants to be back in fellowship. But then Yahweh exposes the truth of his heart, that he's absolutely terrified of what's about to happen. So much so that Jacob is almost like it would be better not to go. And how many times have we said that? How many times have we begun a business venture or a new relationship or a friendship or some other thing, and we meet adversity and we say, it would have been better to have never have met you. It would have been better for I have never had this vehicle. Guess who's going to answer? That which gave it to you in the first place is, oh, you don't want it? All right, let me take that back. And all of a sudden you roll your car. All of a sudden you aren't with a job. All of a sudden COVID hits and everybody's laid off. Because it would have been better for this business to have never existed. How many times have you said, you know what, that person should be fired, or that person should have this, or that person shouldn't be allowed to drive a vehicle? And in the deep mystical sense, those are your mirrors about yourself. And next thing you know, you don't have a vehicle. This is the power of covenant, the depth of faith. Do you know? I'm just going to put this out here. The concept of faith is so simple. It is just this. All it is how a plant can withstand wind and not break. It can bend and it bounces back. That's emunah. And what is that concept? Operating within covenant. Operating within covenant. So now we've covered two questions in one simple discussion about the difference between the name Israel and the name Yaakov. And I can tell you there's a lot of rabbinical writings about the name Jacob versus the name Israel. And there is a lot that can be said about the fact that it is not called the land of Jacob. Did anybody miss the fact that Joseph says, it's not fair that I was taken from the land of the Hebrews, but everything says that Jacob left the land of Canaan? Joseph was so deeply involved in the depth of covenant with his creator that he called it what it truly was, even though it wasn't. And now we call this the land of Israel. We don't call it the land of Jacob. And an Israelite, not a Jacobite. Okay? Now, there is a significance to the fact that Jacob takes his possessions with him and doesn't abandon them, even though that's what Pharaoh said to do. And although I let it breeze by when we brought it up earlier about Pharaoh's saying, hey, let those things go. And we did allow for there to be a context of an idea that when there is going to be a relocation, there's a necessity to let go of that which we've been holding on to. What you didn't see there is that instruction from Pharaoh to let go of the covenant proof. Let go of the proof of the covenant, because there's better yet to come. Because I really needed you guys to understand that Abraham and his wife going down to Mitzrayim part. Okay? Okay. So now, in principle, what is the next question?
Okay, so we covered why did Elohim call Israel Jacob, and what is the significance of chapter 46, verse 5.
We covered that as well.
Mhm.
In that the sons of Israel, in other words, they were in covenant operation, took their father Jacob, who was not in covenant operation, and were obedient. Where Jacob was not wanting to go, they picked their father up and took him there. Okay. So then finally, we come to question number 9, which is what?
Jumped. Question number 9. What is the significance of 66 verse of the 66 verse 70?
Verses 70. Okay. So what that is and where that is significant. So basically there's this after this part of the narrative, there's a bunch of genealogy stuff. Okay. But this is what it says in, and before we move on to that, by the way, does anybody want to comment on what I've said so far about Jacob versus Israel?
I think it's very significant that you cannot walk in your identity, in your true identity or purpose, if you're walking in fear.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, is this a universal law?
Well, you and I have had discussions about how fear must be a vibrational attractor or something along those lines of that pulls you out of purpose and identity and attracts the thing that you're afraid of.
I was wondering if you all were going to let me just drop into this next discussion without bringing this up. That Jacob was operating in his fear because Yahweh told him, don't be afraid. And what's interesting is when we read this, and like I said, if you guys had not brought it up, I would have just kept going, because we either get into it or we don't. But the concept, and this is important, is that he says, do not, I'm sorry, be not afraid of going down to Egypt, for a great nation I set thee there. I go down with thee to Egypt, and I also certainly bring thee up. And Joseph doth put his hand on thine eyes. I have an unfinished series on this channel called Renewing the Mind. And one of the reasons I stopped is because I began to feel afraid that if I spoke it, not only would I have to live it, but I would not have the option to go back on what I said. And I will admit, I will openly admit, in a state of vulnerability and humility, that I quit teaching the Renewing Your Mind series because I became afraid of what I was actually learning. Because what I was learning, and if you go watch the Renewing Your Mind series, you'll see it stops in a mini series called Imagination. What I was learning is that I actually am able to imagine bad things happening better than I can imagine good things happening. Because if you think about it, all fear is a construct of our imaginations, meaning we use frames of references and imagined future scenarios to construct a fantasy. Get this now, a fantasy about the future. We fantasize about bad things happening. We put scripting and characters and acting into play that does not exist. A Hebrew never thought about the future. Do you know that in a Hebrew mindset, there are three, get that one back up. There are three things that are absolutely imperative that you need to know. Number one is that the entire system of understanding is actually a perception of visual, physical danger. How? Because this man is facing the Mediterranean Sea as a state of chaos and tumultuous, stormy, taking my friend when we're swimming, can't do anything about sea swallowing the sun, and to my back is the east, Kedem. To my back is the unknown or the ancient. Because over time, that which is known is forgotten. And the premise is that what I can see right now is not fear, but danger. But what I can see in the future is fear. So if I go out into the wilderness hiking and I think to myself, I need to take some bear spray with me because maybe there might be a bear, I don't perceive a bear in front of me. Now, preparedness is very different. We have a right to bear arms for a reason. But the premise is that what we see versus what we think is going to happen are two different things. And so now we're hiking along and we have this fear that we are going to encounter a bear. So we stop on that trail, turn around, and go home. Was there ever a bear? Nope. Do we have any idea what is at the end of that trail? Nope. Whereas we're hiking along and everything's great, and all of a sudden there's a bear and her cubs on the trail. That's danger, but not fear. So the intrigue here is within the context of standing steadfast in a covenant because somebody made a promise and you being able to depend on that. One of the things about you enter into a covenant with a military power and say, you're going to protect me. And if you are attacked, I'm going to protect you, or at least I'm going to join you in battle. My land is your land is my land. My weapons are your weapons are my weapons. And in that concept, now you can feed your sheep on my land, I can feed my sheep on your land. But if there's a military conflict, we will join each other together against that military conflict. To now say oh, it's a military conflict, let's run out to battle, and in your mind believe that the other one's not going to show up. First of all, is that a real thing? Yep, very, right? Is somebody dependable enough? And where's our frame of reference? With our parents, with our teachers, with our bosses, those in authority not showing up when they have committed to doing so. And so now we have this military power who we're going to depend on. We're going to run out into battle and they're going to show up. I don't think so. Why not? Because mom and dad didn't show up when they said they were gonna, which is a wound, which is what? A twisted consciousness. So in reality, what Jacob was doing, he had two elements that he was doing here. One is he did not believe that Joseph was alive. That's why Yahweh responds to his fear with, Joseph's going to close your eyes, dude. You're going to die in Joseph's presence. The one you thought was dead is now alive. And you're going to die with him beside you. Second, that I will be with you. Why would he need to say that to Jacob? Because Jacob did not believe that he would be with him. What did Joseph tell his brothers? Don't be afraid on the path. In other words, don't be so scared that you never walk the walk, that you never halakha, that you never actually do the things. Don't be so scared that you never walk in purpose. That's what Joseph was telling those men. Walk in your purpose because you don't have to be afraid. And then Yahweh has to tell it to Jacob. And Jacob is so tweaked that his sons have to carry him down to Egypt.
Well, figure. I mean, who knows that if the lie had to be exposed somehow at this point, right? You know, but they had lied to him that Joseph was dead. Now he's probably thinking they're probably lying to me that he's alive.
Just so I'll go down to Egypt.
Just so I'll go down
because
to Egypt.
Obviously they've been seduced by the dark side. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. Him not believing that the truth that Joseph was alive and that him being afraid that it was all a lie again. And
yeah. Okay. Anybody want to comment on that at all out there in on Zoom? Listen, it's kind of a no-brainer. We know that we're ruled by fear. But what we don't realize is how much that actually causes a cognitive dissonance if we try to trust God. And like I said, I stopped the renewing your mind series because I began to realize that if I taught this, that I would have to stop imagining fear. Because my expectation is that when I teach the Renewing Your Mind series, that it's going to revolutionize you guys' brain so thoroughly that you would stop operating in the function, or I should say the dysfunction that your brain's operating right now. And it wasn't a fear in the sense of that I would look bad if I made a mistake. That wasn't it. It was that if I teach this and I have to live it, then I have to be in a state in which I no longer use my imagination the wrong way. And I didn't feel like I had the discipline to teach that to you guys and then demonstrate myself in a state of fear. It wasn't about having a bad image. It was about being a bad example. Because truth be told, is the only bad behavior that exists is bad training. And so in that sense, you will see Renewing Your Mind stops at the Imagination series, I think probably number 3, because it's wounds, entitlements, limiting beliefs, and a lack of imagination. And truth be told, is that lack of imagination is the difference between you and those who you look at and say you wish you had that. Let's move on. And actually, you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and skip this last question because the next one after that is the Rabbi's Nugget. And I want to spend the entire next session on the Rabbi's Nugget. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we will have the Rabbi's Nugget. Let me go ahead and prepare you for it. What's the big deal about Goshen? Okay. So for those of you who are not going to be able to join us for the Rabbi's Nugget, we'll say Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are going to stay,